if not better. This is a session I've been looking forward to for a very long time to talk about the opportunities and challenges for traditional business given the digital world that we all live in. Never looked more obvious to me as I thought about this panel than it did, I think, just within the last week when I noticed that a Pulitzer Prize in publishing was given to two online publications for the first time, Huffington Post and Politico, and thought that kind of was a great way to sort of set up this conversation. And you'll hear less from me in this conversation, I think, than you did in the one this morning, because our panelists are really much more immersed in the digital world and interesting business opportunities and innovation opportunities going on, and have a lot of things to share with you. But we'll try to keep it very conversational. We don't have any presentations to make. We just have a series of questions. And as with this morning, I will invite those of you in the audience to come to the front of one of the aisles where you see microphones set up. And if you just make sure I see you, then as soon as the conversation breaks, we'll break and make sure you get a chance to ask your question. So let me start by introducing and welcoming the two panelists you see with me on the stage. To my left is Marc Lefar. Marc joined Vonage as the Chief Executive Officer in July of 2008. Over the past 27 years, I think he started when he was 10, Marc has developed a unique blend of global marketing, financial, and operational expertise. Prior to joining Vonage, Marc served as Chief Marketing Officer of Singular Wireless, now AT&T Mobility. He also played a major leadership role in the acquisition and successful integration of AT&T Wireless into Singular in 2005. He's also one of the lead executives in developing the exclusive relationships with Apple for the iPhone, and worked directly with Steve Jobs in that area. His experience in the wireless industry is extensive, including senior executive roles at GTE Wireless, Verizon Wireless, and Cable and Wireless Global. His career began at Procter & Gamble, however, so it's not all been in this digital world that we're here to talk about today. At P&G, he held positions of increasing responsibility in both finance and brand management in the US and Eastern Europe. Marc has been recognized as one of Advertising Age's power players and is a recipient of the Marketing Top 50 Award. He's been a frequent speaker on technology and marketing strategy, having addressed diverse audiences, including the CTIA, CTAM, the Rutberg Conference, and others. In June of this past year, Marc was appointed by President Obama to serve on the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. So it's been wonderful today to have so much connection with this conference and what's going on at UVA and what's going on in Washington. Marc is a graduate of the McIntire School of Commerce and resides in Atlanta. Also on the panel is David Kinney. David is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Weather Channel Companies, my favorite app, by the way. David was recently appointed Chairman and CEO of the Weather Channel. He has a strong record in the media and digital industries and works closely with the management team and board of directors to leverage the company's unique collection of media assets and to spearhead further development of a comprehensive integrated strategy to accelerate its growth in the United States and internationally. Previously, David co-founded and served as managing partner of Viviki, I'm pronouncing that correctly, the combined worldwide media and digital arm of Publicis Group, and he was chairman and CEO at Digitas Inc., a top global integrated brand agency. He currently serves as a member of the board of directors of Yahoo and a director of Teach for America, a nonprofit that enlists recent graduates to teach and to effect change in under-resourced and low-income communities. And David may be interested to know that at UVA there is a tremendous growing interest in the whole area of social entrepreneurship, which is a track that we featured this year in our Entrepreneurship Cup competition, and I hope that we can have a panel on social entrepreneurship next year. So I invite you back right now to take a part in that. So I want to get started with some questions, and again, let the conversation just unfold from there. It's structured enough that we could, just the three of us could do this for the whole 50 minutes, but I think all three of us are anxious to hear from you as well and make sure we're responding to your questions. Maybe if I could start with this question. David, I'd love to have you respond to the following. More than 15 years ago, you saw an opportunity to redefine the advertising industry when you founded Digitas. Tell us what you saw, and why couldn't larger agencies compete effectively in that area? I'd love to know where the traditional agencies have caught up.
Yep, so 15 years ago I was at Bain & Company in consulting, working with American Express, and they wanted to know what the internet meant. In that process I met Steve Case in Virginia, and also met Jerry Yang and Tim Kugel at Yahoo in the early days. The question was, what are people going to pay for this? And my view was probably nothing, because you can always go to a library. And maybe this is more like the radio. And so if they became the radio and the newspaper and the television, what would be the advertising? And it needed to be different. It needed to use technology. It needed to use data. It needed to be relevant to what people cared about. And I really didn't think it was going to get there from traditional agencies. So that was my idea to start Digitas. And at the time, everybody was interested in .com, so Digitas was digital gravitas. So digital for big companies. And we went and took big budgets away from a lot of advertisers at big agencies. Why didn't they do it? I think that they were trying to meet shareholder demands. They were trying to protect their margins. They were not fully understanding it. Couldn't necessarily attract the talent because they didn't have equity packages. And I think there was just a little bit of a fear that it would cannibalize, and in fact it did. So in the end, what the big agencies did is they bought Digitas. In fact, when I went public on March 2000, there were a sector of 10 digital agencies, and I ended up buying 8 of them. Putting them all into Publicis. So that's what they do, is they acquire. I still don't think it's integrated. I still think the talents aren't there. It's better, but it's really hard for people who work their whole careers to get top of their game, knowing advertising one way, and then finding out they need different skills. And they just don't trade out the management fast enough. So I think it's generational. I think it's another 10 years before the managements turn over. All the agency holding companies are led by people in their 60s and 70s who started them. And until that changes and the next generation changes, it's going to be hard for me to see the cultures move fast enough.
Well, I was one of the early customers. I mean, I looked at some of the traditional agencies back when I came to Singular Wireless back in 2002, and there was a talent gap, there was a passion gap, and what I don't think people understood, I think it's still the issue now on all forms of digital marketing and advertising, is the functions were so siloed. Creatives create creative executions, media people do media, and in a world where the context in which you absorb the creative is so important. Context drives the effectiveness. You needed to have people that had both the understanding of how the media works, where people are absorbing content, and then write the advertising or the digital creative in a way that it made it work together. And that was true not just for traditional internet advertising, but even in terms of the sites, commerce sites, service sites that were being built for companies. And I still don't think that there's a training ground in a university environment or even in the advertising agencies themselves to groom people to think both creatively as well as very rationally about what the media allows. I think it's a gap.
Interesting. I'm anxious to know if you see, I know Marc, as I mentioned, you're an alum of the University of Virginia, and you've had some interaction with some of our innovation initiatives here at the university. I'm interested in the comment you just made about the training gap and the fact that it's challenging to maybe teach the kinds of skills and attributes that you're looking for. Are you seeing things that are being done at UVA or other universities you interact with, or that could be done that would help bridge that gap?
I think that there's some real progress being made. I think there's a few universities that do this pretty well and create an environment where they interact with the business community and have broken out of the silos inside of the university community. And I think UVA is starting to move into what I'll call that elite 5 or 10%. I'm personally really excited about the Open Grounds initiative. Tom brought me in, made me aware of what was going on probably almost a year ago now, and we're going to be sponsoring a couple of projects there, an innovation challenge about the next wave of what text messaging might evolve to, as well as a quantitative approach to how does virality really work. And we've talked about how we might create some of those kind of research projects, but I think that what makes me excited about it is having a place where the goal is, one, to bring people from very different functions, very different specializations, and force them to problem solve together. I had the chance to work with Steve Jobs very closely for a number of years, and people will ask me frequently, well, what made him so special? And my answer is not the same as what is in the book. What made him special, in my opinion, and I spent tons of time with him, there is nobody I've ever come across that in one person understood so incredibly well and deep all of the technology enablers and what's happening in technology, and still had the level of passion, understanding, and appreciation for consumer interaction with technology. It's very rare to find somebody who can put all of that stuff together and have a futuristic vision of both. And he was that guy. People like that in history, and I think David's more of a student of it than I am and likes to talk about some of those folks. But that was impressive to me, and I look at it here and say, look, we can't hope to create a bunch of Steve Jobs, but we sure should be able to put people with that level of skill set in certain areas in the same room and teach them how to collaborate to solve problems. If we think about the kind of graduate school talent, the undergraduate energy levels, the kind of things that faculty members are doing, we're solving in very narrow silos. And it's a problem for me to hire people, and it's a problem for, I think, folks to find great jobs that get them the kind of success they want. So I am excited about what's happening here. I think the walls need to be broken down much more in the schools environment. I think forced curriculum that actually cross those schools far more is mandatory. I'm now reading books. I was telling David over lunch, I'm catching up on the books that I probably should have read and not just use Cliff's Notes when I was here as an undergrad, because my focus was getting into the undergraduate business school because I needed a job. And it was a great experience for me, and it's worked out just fine. Yep. But I feel like I missed part of the skill sets I would have needed to really have been more effective in impacting the world.
If I could add a little.
Yeah, please,
so
please.
2 weeks from today is the 30th anniversary of the Weather Channel. So our first broadcast was May 2nd, 1982. And a guy named Frank Batten at the University of Virginia came up with that idea. And it was an audacious idea that people would watch weather 24 hours a day.
Yep.
Right? And it was a ridiculous idea. And it wasn't just an audacious idea. Cable was just getting started. Turner was doing CNN. This required 10,000 servers to be put into the cable system to deliver local on the 8s. Because people really only care about weather where they are. For the most part. So it was a huge idea, and it almost didn't work. And then he had to get the cable operators to pay for it. And then 15 years into that, the internet came along. Most people in cable wanted to resist it because it broke the business model. And they went full force. He went full force into weather.com. 8 years after that, we started the mobile apps. It's the second most popular app after Angry Birds on the iPad. And it's so
Vonage Mobile catching up.
You and 80 million other people love our apps, and it's on the phone. It's behind Angry Birds, Facebook, Skype, and Pandora. So there was never a fear of cannibalization. There was always a fear of learning. There's no way that Frank Batten knew 30 years ago about the internet or about mobile, but he established, and I'm so privileged to lead his company. He established a principle of lifelong learning, and I think part of his gifts back to UVA. Both the school on public policy and what he's done at Darden was about that. Yep. And I think what you are teaching is principles here, as opposed to thinking it's skills.
Right.
And I think that's a really important contribution. I would only add one little point, because we do a lot of recruiting, and I had Akamai and Digitas before. There is an East Coast, West Coast split here that's really worth understanding. To overly generalize, and it's not true for everyone, but generally the students we got on the West Coast were interested in building something quick. Maybe you could get 12 friends to launch Instagram, sell it for $1 billion, and be done. And it's like this, and there's great apps. The East Coast is more interested in infrastructure, in longevity, in enduring institutions. So here, and the technology world, MIT, Some of the rest of the Ivy League schools, all like you, it makes a big difference. And I think it's important that you're teaching enduring innovation versus quick hits. I think both are important, but I think we'll see more sway of innovation to the East Coast over time. Both coasts are important here, and they're not exactly the same.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Marc, you're making me nervous with your answer about your time here as a student. I was wondering if I had to remind you about the UVA honor code, but sounds like we stayed out of dangerous territory.
We were all good.
I'm also intrigued with the fact that you began your career in P&G. P&G is certainly recognized in my area today as a company that's really changing itself and changing the way it innovates, but it hasn't been that way for very long. And making the change from a more traditional industry sector 20 years ago into the digital world, that had to be pretty darn interesting. You had to feel like a pioneer. Stefan Dolezalek this morning talked about the pioneering spirit in U.S. innovation. Tell me how things have changed since you started 20 years ago in this digital world, and what do you see as the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities, the biggest competitors?
Well, when I went to Procter & Gamble, it was the place where it was continual learning. It was basically they're going to, help broaden you, help think about the skill sets that you may not have gotten as an undergrad. They'll teach you what you need to know, and had a phenomenal reputation to work with extraordinarily smart people from all functions, and that to me was critically important. I wanted to be stimulated by other people, and that's something that's always been important to me in my career. I had the opportunity coming in kind of my 8th or 9th year in the company to go start up their business in Eastern Europe. This is shortly after the wall came down, and my wife and I at the time were some of the first American expats. There were a couple PepsiCo folks there, but we were the first Americans to go into Prague. And there were no restaurants. There's cheap beer, which still exists, but that was about it. And I started to understand what learning on the infrastructure side really was like. We had salespeople delivering detergent in the backs of cars. We're trying to build manufacturing facilities in a place where we had 3 times the overemployment for what was actually needed to run a soap factory, and people didn't come to work for a month because it was nicer at the lake, and they didn't know they didn't need to show up to work. Have that conversation with one of your employees when they come back, and they just look at you, well, why did I have to be here? That didn't make any sense. And I have to say, I really enjoyed that. I started to learn who I was, which was, Procter & Gamble in the U.S. was very much apps. It was how many flavors of cake mix do you need? Duncan Hines, we give 3 more flavors, and how many more fragrances of Tide? And we could throw a lot of Harvard and Darden MBAs at that project, and I'll say, well, we'll come up with the best ones and market it like crazy and build huge businesses. And by that time, I was kind of asleep. And so when someone talked about this wireless industry, I didn't get into it quite as early as Governor Warner, but I was in it in '94. I think there was about 15 million cell phones in the country, and the average cost of a device was somewhere around $600 or $700. There were no subsidies, and it was 50 cents a minute to use it. And it was mostly car phones. I said, this is going to be something that is huge, and I just want to be part of it. And I've always, when people say, so what's most important about the job you're taking? What are you doing, and why? I want to have a really good cocktail party conversation about it. So I hope that every job I take, I actually come away with something that when I'm 75 years old, I can tell these really good stories about the times when. And I've tried to manage my career that way in terms of being part of infrastructure plays. When I got into the wireless business, that's exactly what it was. The talent was weak. People were not trained. They were hungry. They were passionate. And everybody felt they were part of something that was going to be really, really big. And many of us spent years building that infrastructure for what has become some very famous and very wealthy people to put their applications on top of it. We're the first customers, supporters of ringtones and SMS and third-party publishers and content to put on wireless phones, and built the infrastructure to enable that. But the big change there was going from an apps world to an infrastructure world, and I found that's just kind of who I was. And I've been doing that since.
Fascinating. I want to also get back to this, the mention I made of the way the publishing industry is changing because of advances in the digital arena. I mentioned the 2 Pulitzer Prizes in the last week. It seems like traditional newspapers are on life support. And I guess I'm wondering if you guys think they're going to just fade away. Are they one grammatically challenged person I heard recently said, are they a thing of the past? Are they a thing of the past in the future? Why are they struggling so much? And what can we expect? How are we going to get our news as well as our weather?
Well, you like your app, right? So anything's challenged that it doesn't innovate. I think that all this mobile infrastructure has people wanting to get more information real time. So if I take the weather, people who take those apps, and most people have them, in fact, most people who have a smartphone have them, and if you buy a Nokia, it's now preloaded. They check it 5-6 times a day. They check more locations. They want to know more. People actually learn what barometric pressure means and why to know that. So you engage. You go to the web. You check morning and night. The TV you watch, sometimes morning, often night. So same thing with newspapers. They're a morning event. They're not there. They're not instant. People don't want to wait for that. So I would say they are challenged. There's a role, but they are challenged because if you define yourself as a newspaper, you're very limited. If you define yourself as a journalist and you're distributing that however people want, real time, engaging with them, you've got a fun future.
Yeah.
Huffington Post is an awesome contribution to journalism. So I don't think journalists are dead. I think people want news. People want quality. I think if you define yourselves by your content, you're fine. If you define yourself by your format, just as if we had done that, you lose relevance.
Right.
I'm glad we have all the formats.
I think there's another dynamic that plays into that too, though, which is you define yourself by your content, but the internet has democratized who can be a journalist. Content can be created by anybody, shared broadly, and whether it is fact-checked and reasonable or it's hearsay and slanderous, that information can get out. And the tools to be able to understand what to believe and where can be almost overwhelming for many people. And I think one of the challenges for many of the brand name publishers, the New York Times to Wall Street Journal, they're trying to figure out, okay, if news can happen everywhere and we can't have it covered all over, to what extent do we allow the world to create the news? And if that's true, what is our role? Is it distribution? Is it editorial? Is it curation? Is it split so that all the stuff that the journal endorses on the left side and on the right side is all the stuff that comes and you kind of reader beware? It's a wonderful thing to be able to get information from so many places, and I think there's an important role for the publishers. But I don't think they've greeted it very well because I think it gets back to skill sets and habits. They're afraid to eat their young. I think they're afraid to lose the revenue streams. They're afraid to have the control that gave people their social currency in the world. I'm an editor of. I decide what people read. I decide how that's going to be done and what order they're going to see it and how I'm going to digest those facts. And a digital world isn't going to tolerate that anymore. I was with Alan Murray at the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, and Alan is the deputy publisher of the paper, the Wall Street Journal, but he also has full responsibility for all their digital properties. They have something called Wall Street Journal Live and a whole host of digital properties, and they're trying to think about how they break up their storylines, video, pictures, news, and feed that into other services, into applications, and how's the Wall Street Journal's brand give credibility to that. They've now equipped all of their journalists, print journalists, with iPhones and little stands that have stabilization applications on them. And he showed me some of their Wall Street Journal Live feeds from places we would never expect to get great news. And sure enough, one guy by himself on a battlefield is doing a video interview being fed live and then being propagated into the YouTube section of Wall Street Journal. So I think they really are trying to move that direction, but he also made the comment that said, well, we kind of need a big sponsor to get in this. For us to really scale this, we need like $5 million to do X, Y, and Z. I'm thinking, this is News Corp. This is News Corp. $5 million, how could that even be a barrier? And it is. It's still a function of prove it, scale it, and then maybe we'll invest in it. And I personally have a belief, and I'm seeing it in my own company, that you can try all you want, but unless you really shelter these startup companies inside of your own company, really break all the rules, change the reward system, put them in different office space, give them different systems, and let them use your company at an arm's length if they want to, and if they don't have to. And treat them as entrepreneurs, treat yourself as an investor. And it's hard to do in a big company, but when we've done it on a couple of projects, we're getting better time to market. We are still failing. We fail fast, and we try to fail cheaply, but it seems to be a better model for us, and I think we're going to need to see that in publishing for it to change.
The other problem with big companies is they're walled gardens, which is, News Corp I also know well. So because they want to protect it, and I also think the future of media is very much an ecosystem. So I get what the Wall Street Journal is doing in the New York Times, but the local newspapers really struggle, and we find them to all be our friends because it turns out no one goes to weather.com. They go to one of 40,000 city pages because that's what they really care about. And we're beginning to have people feed their local content there because it's a place people can get it, and we can aggregate an audience. They can't build it themselves. And then we, in turn, work with Twitter because there are 200 tweets per minute about the weather, and it's really important when a tornado's coming that people tweet each other. It saves lives, right? So this whole, you got to think way outside your own company if you want to be successful in the future. And I think that's especially true in media, though, and the big ones struggle with that. Mm-hmm. The smaller ones are very open. The HuffPost is incredibly open. Politico is incredibly open. And I think that's where it's going. So figuring out an ecosystem will be equally important there.
Interesting. Well, I have a momentary pause. Let me remind you, we're delighted and hopeful that you'll ask your own questions. We've just talked about publishing newspapers. What other industries or business models are threatened or at risk in this digital age, or will be changing dramatically if they wish to survive?
Well, I mean, I think we've already seen what's happened in the music business. You can see how that's changed. Steve had a view that people wanted to buy singles, not entire albums. Yeah. Of course, everybody knew that. It was just that there was more money to be made if you sold it as an album and brought the extra tracks along for the ride. Steve, based on having built a device and a preferred approach to listen to music, had strategic control to be able to get people to roll over, break it up, and he had pricing control. So he changed and delivered what customers wanted anyway, and the music industry didn't do it for themselves fast enough, and somebody else did it to them. I think the same thing is the battle is raging for all forms of video entertainment, television and film. So we look at what's happening with Netflix, what do you see with Hulu, and you can argue about the varying degrees of success and the sustainability of the models, but the big debate is still around, okay, people want to watch the newest episodes of the newest shows and movies they want to be able to, instead of going to, people don't like to go to movie theaters. Teenagers do, but most people don't. You really want to watch it in your own home. And it's a financial issue about why you can't get first-run movies delivered to your home as soon as they're released. You don't want to put 20 people in there. You can't make as much money on it. So I think what we're seeing is now the people that have a vested interest in these businesses, so from NBC and ABC to Universal and all of the film studios, they're trying to decide what to hold back. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too, make enough to create traction, but hold back the stuff that doesn't cause the walls to collapse. And as long as they own enough of the rights to keep those things separated, they'll manage that slow migration of revenue. Eventually, we'll watch first-run movies on our television sets, on our iPads, but it's a traditional businessman trying to protect their model as long as they can and prop up those margins before you get down the slippery slope. But I think that television, cable, the film industry is going to look completely different in 5 to 10 years than it does today.
Interesting. I see that Paul Corson from the Department of Commerce has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've touched on it in a number of different ways, but maybe just narrow down a little bit. I'm very interested in the way that executives make decisions about their R&D spending and the consequences of those decisions on startup firms and the scaling of firms. And so maybe if you could just speak a little bit more about that in the context of what your decisions mean and what the government's decisions mean about investing in R&D, and how it relates to that innovation that we all want, but then the effect that maybe it can squelch innovation.
Let me take a swing at it. Maybe you can help me, David. Mm-hmm. So as a CEO, what I would tell you is, particularly as a public company CEO, and we could have a whole other 2-hour session on the difference between being a public company CEO and a private company CEO. There is a reward system that is fundamentally unhealthy, in my opinion, around public companies and how it allows true core research and how it gets accounted for, when it succeeds or fails, and what the marketplace is used to getting. It is unacceptable to fail in any significant way if you're a public company. All the reward systems are completely against it. So you either modify your bets and don't go deep enough, long enough, unless you're a huge company and can kind of bury some of those dollars. But for mid-sized companies like mine, you got to make some really, really hard choices. And it's frankly counter to what a lot of the executives in the companies want to be able to do, because we know that you've got plenty of venture capitalists in the room. I'm told that the real win rate, number of companies that you consider to be really successful, if you're lucky, is 9 out of 10. I'm sorry, it's 1 out of 10. 9 failures for every 1 meaningful success. If you did that in a corporate public company and had to invest meaningfully in each of those businesses, that CEO is not going to have a job for very long. I can guarantee you that. So I do think that there is a role to be played, an important role both by venture capital, but I also think that the government can actually provide support for what I'll call those core research and infrastructure development projects. I think some level of safety that encourages and fosters that kind of risk-taking that frankly provides a shelter from the public markets that says, look, I've got to take this opportunity. It's a way to build jobs. It's a way to make the U.S. superior. It is a way that we challenge our people and keep our workforce here. And I do think that there is short-term, long-term trade-offs, and it's gone the wrong direction over the last 30 years in a very significant way. And I think we're fortunate to have the kind of venture capital, private equity investments that allow for greater losses, despite sometimes the value destruction, sometimes constructive destruction, sometimes just ugly destruction of value that comes from those investments.
Yep. So I agree with that. I would add, in the companies I've run, I've looked at R&D on horizons. So about half the R&D needs to be something that's commercial within the next couple of years. And then you can have another third that's going to be products that come out 2 to 4 or 5 years. And you really can only put 10, 20% at most. And I never really kind of got beyond 10 in kind of the third horizon, which is stuff that's great ideas, fundamental transformation, but it might take a few years to come to market. So I think businesses have to think that way, and they have to align with the time frames of their investors, which is where VC plays an important role, although it also tends to do things that are more near term. So I think government plays some role on the long term things. I think there's the second place I think governments have to do, though, particularly this government, is figure out what is the new model of IP. Yeah. Because the other way R&D works is when we share. And I'm a big believer in open source. A lot of the innovations that I've been involved with happen that way. But the rules around IP are very unclear in the software world. So people don't know what they have. And quite honestly, some of the rules don't apply to the current technology. They apply to software when it was packaged. And so I think there's a lawmaking, policy-making side to this as well, beyond just R&D. We will get more development if we're more open source, if we share and build on each other's innovations more.
Would you agree, though, that the level of corporate investment in what I'll call real research and development over the 7 to 15-year time frame, with the exception of maybe a couple industries like healthcare, is a small fraction of what most of the executive teams would, if you polled CEOs privately, would they believe it should be, would they like to be investing?
Yeah, of course, right? And I think that, but I don't know that that's a wrong answer, because I look at Yahoo, where I sit on the board, I look at Google Labs. Sometimes people have the luxury to be able to do this, but it doesn't always have the discipline. So I also kind of like survival of the fittest, and I like that you kind of have to commercialize things in a business because they're not the same as academic institutions, and you can't really use capital in the same way. So people want to do it, but I like the discipline actually of, can this be commercialized?
So what role do you think that academic institutions and government have to play in accelerating that kind of long-term investment?
Well, yeah, because the question was government, but I actually think universities are really critical to the competitiveness of the nation. I think that is a place where people should seek to do long-term work, and there needs to be enough research, and those of us who fund institutions need to support that. Then there needs to be better ways to share it. And I think the academic community does a pretty good job of that, but we could use technology to share better. I spent a lot of time in China. There are pros and cons to that system, but the government kind of owns everything, and it's shared. And I think that they are making faster advances in some places than others. I think their universities are connected in tighter ways, and we probably have to look at that. So, but I do think universities will be more important in the future to winning in an innovation race.
Yes.
My question is with respect to early adoption. In the past, there used to be a real focus on being an early adopter. Now, when I listen to a lot of companies, for example, Vonage, doing voice over IP, what percentage of time do you spend being an early adopter of technology? IPv4 to IPv6 transition took a long time, and of course, it had its technical problems.
It's still not done.
That's right.
Yeah, but I also think that are firms like you're spending enough time trying to test beds for these applications so that they can get to market, so they can work out the kinks like it used to be before. I just think there's a lot of good technology that comes out, but people are so afraid to touch it. We talk more about applications. We're trying to get things out to the market that we can make money. And what are enabling the technology to mature and become successful so more applications can actually sit on them?
It's a great question. I can speak to it from a Vonage perspective, but our company history is a little bit different in that Vonage was a very early adopter. Voice over IP existed long before Vonage showed up. It just never been commercialized for the consumer in a way that delivered reasonable quality. The company's 10 years old. Broadband penetration when the founder started Vonage was about 22% in the U.S., and it wasn't the same kind of broadband we know now. So he took a real flyer on that. He also was the founder of Daytech Online and said, let's disrupt the basic retail brokerage industry by doing online trading. And he did that at a time when there was almost zero broadband. It was dial-up. The idea of disrupting industries and leveraging new technology, even if it's imperfect in terms of how the consumer or the enterprise uses it, you'll find that pattern through most wildly successful companies. In the case of Vonage, they grew too fast, some other issues, intellectual property disputes, and were near bankruptcy when I came in. And we're now back to the point where we are doing a lot more of that core research, where we're trying to understand what the emerging technologies are, how will multi-mode communications of one-to-one and one-to-many people work, what will happen with machines, which devices. We don't think about it as voice and messaging. We think about it as an identity on different ends of the internet, and how can you actually traverse that in a quality way and leverage the networks of phone numbers and user IDs that exist. So we do think about some of those things much more broadly. Of course, the funds to commercialize those and to test those can be limited in a company that's $900 million in revenue. So we are working with universities. We work with partners. We fund projects, and we spin off little greenhouses inside of our own organization with some of our technologists who have some really cool ideas. We don't want to get in the way. So we are doing that. I can't speak to if there's a process by which it's happening in other companies. I can tell you from having been in many of the wireless carriers, they're actually getting a little bit better at it right now. So things like looking at what's going to happen with electric grids and machine-to-machine use of wireless technologies, and they're cordoning off separate organizations and significant budgets to go after those. But there was a window. It didn't happen until you started to plateau in the basic core product growth. Once we get to 80% penetration of wireless subscribers in the U.S., then it gets interesting to look at what's the next pop. I think the real challenge is how do you create those next ideas and the investment even while businesses are growing. That's the healthiest time to do it. And if it's when the business is humped over and is starting to lose ground, then it's frequently too late because there's too much pressure to be successful, so you start taking a short-term mentality. I don't know if, David, you have something to add.
There's two parts to your question that I want to deal with. One, you mentioned IPv4 and IPv6. That's a real issue. If you don't get to V6, the internet economy stops because people have more devices than addresses. Everybody who's close to it knows it. Nobody spends time on infrastructure because nobody makes money in infrastructure. I used to run Akamai. We cared more about it. And I worked on this in 3 levels last year. So one, our former CTOs here, and we worked here on at least policy and encouragement, and the U.S. made some progress. Beijing made it the law, and Beijing will have an advantage on V6 the way Asia also had an advantage on having wireless standards that we didn't have in this country. So standards and infrastructure matter, and they're a combined interest, and we don't know how to deal with that. And then I dealt with Brussels, and they were so panicked about just like bankruptcies of Italy that they couldn't even think about V6 because they didn't know there'd even be an EU by the time it mattered. So, but all of that comes down to there are common interests, and we need a better way to work on those. So nobody's doing that part. The second part on longer term, it's hard to find all the innovations in a company. So our little weather company, what do? We've opened it up, so we build SDKs for anyone who does local. So now I've got dozens of startups doing crowdsourced traffic, doing TaskRabbit, doing Uber where you can get cars, all these local apps, trying to figure out how they can build local apps that live with ours. Because we couldn't do it all. They had to innovate on top of us. Is Facebook worth $102 billion? I don't know, but a lot of people think so. Well, it's not because of the innovation in their new campus. It's because they've become a platform that hundreds and thousands of companies build on top of. So I think the smart companies figure out how they're a platform for others as well. And because that's how you're going to get the innovation. I don't think you can do it all within your own company.
Interesting. Jim Powers had a question. Jim.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark, and great talk, guys. Really appreciate it. I'm interested in what advice you might have for companies that have disruptive or transformational technologies or science or applications. I'm from the bioscience area, and just looking at the youth that we have up there and you guys and how successful you've become and how visionary you are, I wonder whether in having a transformational science or technology, whether surrounding yourself with very experienced industry types who are older, perhaps from a later generation, is necessarily the best thing. So any general advice you might have around transformational, disruptive technology applications, I greatly appreciate. Thanks.
So maybe I'll go first this time because I love scientists, right? I love hardcore engineers. The folks in Kendall Square, you hang out with these folks. So first of all, I would say don't surround yourself too much with the suits. Take the VC's money, but don't take their direction. Because you gotta love what you started out to do. And I've seen so many great ideas killed by MBAs. And I haven't had one, and MBAs have to be smarter about how to respect and grow the science, or the art. So that's the first thing is believe in it, stick with it, be true to it. You can get advice on shaping it. I think Sheryl Sandberg helped Mark Zuckerberg terrifically, but he didn't put her in charge, right? You can argue the pros and cons of governance on Google, but they're a little afraid of the suits taking over. So I do think it's important to stay true to the science, and if you've got a right idea, stay with it, and help you figure out how to communicate it, but don't let them change it, destroy it, or try to monetize it too early.
I would add to it. I think so I agree with what David said, and won't even attempt to paraphrase in a different way. What I think is critically important is from the very top, making sure that everybody, whatever your composition is, it is. You may have a bunch of suits, you may have a bunch of young guns, you might have a lot of folks. It is being really clear about what your expectations are. Having sat down and say, suits, your job is this. Your job is to support, not get in the way. We know we're going to make mistakes. We know we're going to fail. Here's what it is. And you can maybe put a flashing yellow light out there, but your job is to figure out how to be creative and help these folks win. Because we're not going to cost cut our way to profitability. We're not to long-term growth and profitability. We're not going to change the world by putting more and more walls around things. And I think, I've had to do this several times, and it can get away from you. sitting people down one-on-one or in a group and making it critically clear, we will succeed at this. This is our birthright. This is what we're about. This is who we are. And don't anybody screw this up. And usually that comes out to be those folks you're talking about that are those real technology leaders, the real inventors. They feel that is very empowering. And the folks that know that they've been more blockers than supporters, they kind of step back in line and realize how it works. I would encourage that direction if it hasn't been done. It won't happen softly. It's a real butt-kicking kind of conversation to get people to understand what you expect.
But if you're investing in a scientist or you're running a company where science is important, I think the hard part is to know when it's time to trade the science out and get a new scientist. Founders fall in love with their technologies. They don't move on. They defend the original algorithm a little too far. There's a reason why you have to. The founder syndrome has a negative side to it too. So I think it's really important to know when it's time to trade out. I think it is, on the flip side, one of the advantages of Silicon Valley is that the career paths there are typically scientists as a river flowing through companies, as opposed to this idea of staying with one too long. And I think that builds better ideas. It's kind of like academic collaboration. Being loyal, having your own labs, building everything up yourself, you can really get groupthink, founder think, and just get, completely surprised from a new innovation. So scientists have to make room for other scientists.
Fantastic. Said the suit.
Exactly. I wish I were a scientist. I wasn't smart enough.
Of course, I think we're all suits up here. I'm just checking.
Yeah.
Well, as sort of a last question, we have about 1 minute. So would each of you take 30 seconds to kind of set the stage for our audience as they leave at the end of the day, not after this session, please, and think about this session. What are other companies that you can hold up to them as examples of companies that have adapted well in the digital world? You've mentioned quite a few, but what are the ones that have done well? What are the ones that are really struggling and maybe having to sort of reinvent themselves?
Well, I know it's one that David and I agree on, and in 1 minute I would say probably American Express. Traditional financial services, but having understood what consumer needs are, what the technology allows, how they interact, how they leverage data to be able to tailor things in a one-on-one basis, and then how to, even from a proactive or retention marketing standpoint, leverage what the technology delivers. I think they're a success story. David, you probably know a little bit more about the inside of how they accomplish that. I kind of see it as a consumer and outside business person, but I've been incredibly impressed with what they've done over the last 15 years.
Yeah, if I take Amex, if I take the Home Depot that's done well in retail, if you take Procter, I think that these companies are succeeding not because they're responding to digital. I think that's a little bit of chasing. What they're responding to is the new economy requires rapid innovation.
And they understand what consumers need and want.
Yeah. It's innovation that feeds consumers, but it's really rapid innovation. It's culturally, it's talent, it's respecting the science, it's respecting the artists, and making it all work. But the great companies are ones that know that there's no advantage that's going to last more than 2 years. So they're innovating constantly and at rapid, high scale.
Excellent.